Hi everyone, and welcome back to the 30-second video for the Old Testament Survey course. In this section, we'll finish the poetic books by looking at the Song of Solomon. And we'll start, as usual, with some background issues. First is the name of the book. The first verse of the book says, "The Song of Songs, which is of Solomon." That's why the book is sometimes called the Song of Solomon. And it's also sometimes called the Song of Songs. Both are true and valid titles for this book. Now, the phrase Song of Songs is a standard type of formula in Hebrew grammar, which places a word with itself in order to signify what's called a superlative. That means the highest extent of the quality described by this word. We see it in the tabernacle, where the inner room is called the Holy of Holies. That means the holiest place, the most holy. We saw it in Ecclesiastes, where Kohelet said, vanity of vanities, which means complete vanity, complete meaninglessness, the most meaningless. And King of Kings in the New Testament means not just the king who rules over kings, but the absolute epitome of kingships. Not just king, but kinger, kingest, kingest. So this book is called the number one Song of Solomon, the most important song. Song, songer, songest, the greatest song. Now this book is occasionally called Canticles, which is Latin for song. Now the author of this book must be discussed in relationship with its title. Of Solomon in the first verse can mean written by Solomon. And that's the most likely meaning. But it can also mean about Solomon or for Solomon, etc. So technically the book is anonymous, and there's no way to know for absolute sure who wrote it, although Solomon is a decent possibility for the author. And the date of writing is likely unsure. If Solomon is the author, obviously it was written during his lifetime. Now, like Esther, the Song of Songs was almost not included in the Bible because it seemed a little out of place and doesn't center on God in the same way that most of the Old Testament does. But it is Scripture, and it serves a purpose in God's revelation to us. Now, we'll look at the purpose of the book a little bit more closely in a minute when we discuss the nature and message of the book. But now, let's look at the organization of the Song of Songs. Now, the outline and organization of the book is fairly difficult to discern. And the organization actually depends on the nature of the book. Now, there's some argument about this, and there's two main possibilities discussed, which influence how we might divide up this book and see its organization. The first possibility is that this book is a dramatic story, a love story. Now, based on the pronouns used, there seems to be at least three voices speaking in the book. And some modern translations show this, and they divide and label each part based on who is speaking, using labels such as beloved, lover, and chorus of friends. So that in some sense, it looks like the script of a play. Some interpreters actually include a fourth character and then see this drama as kind of a love triangle. But the second possibility is that this book is a series of love poems. And in this case, each section is only loosely connected with each other. That it's just a group of love poems put together, and we should not try to find some sort of organizing outline for the book as a whole. And that leads us into the content of the book. The first issue we must address is the nature and the content, and how to interpret this book. Now, one of the most popular approaches throughout Christian history was to interpret this book as an allegory. That is, it's not taken at face value, but it represents something else. That is, the lover represents God, and the beloved represents humanity. So this book is taken to be a symbolic picture of the relationship between God and his people. Now, there's some warrant for this. For instance, in Ephesians chapter 5, 22 through 33, where Paul compares the relationship between a husband and wife with the relationship between Christ and his church. And like I said, this view is popular in history. But one thing against this view is that it is especially popular in those times in history when the church was strongly influenced by Neoplatonic philosophy and looked down on the material world as inherently sinful. And therefore, because of this philosophy, they taught that celibacy was the ideal for humans. The greatest thing for humans is to not have romantic physical relationships. But that idea is not biblical. And therefore, I think that they distorted the church's theology and understanding of this book by seeing it through those lenses. And the other thing about this approach is that allegory is inherently subjective. It's not controlled by the Bible itself, but it comes from the imagination of the reader. Now, I think it can be appropriate to use this book as an illustration of God's love for people. But I also think that this book itself is better understood using the second approach. The second approach is to see this book as describing human romantic love. Because this is a part of life. And when we experience it according to God's rules and purposes, it is a very blessed thing. This is part of who we are created to be. So a Christian should not avoid or be ashamed of godly romance and sex. Rather, we should celebrate it and redeem it from our society's twisted understanding and practice of it. We should avoid, obviously, ungodly romance and sex, but we should overcome the evil with good and demonstrate to the world a correct, balanced, biblical view and practice of sex. Now, we all know our culture has an unhealthy view, overly fascinated, twisted. It's all about sex. But too often the church has responded either by pretending sex doesn't exist, we don't talk about that, or by saying that sex, oh, it's dirty, it's cheap, and it's so disgusting that it should only be given to someone that you truly love. No, the church needs to get back to a biblical view of romance and sex. And the Song of Solomon is a helpful part of the Bible's teaching on this subject. See, sex is part of God's good creation. Sex is God's idea. But sex is more than just physical and emotional. Sex is more than just friction. It's not just body parts rubbing together. And it's so much more than just an impersonal thrill ride for selfish gratification. And when our culture glorifies sex and romance outside of God's guidelines, it always cheapens and destroys sex. Because sex and romance are spiritual. And they only find full meaning and experience with the fear of the Lord. Study after study has proven the most sexually and romantically satisfied people are not the players, but they are the people in long-term, faithful, covenant relationship of marriage. Who would have thought that God's way is the best in the long run? Because sex is more than just joining of bodies. It's a joining of souls. Romance and joyfully living together outside of the bedroom are indispensable to experiencing the joyful connection in the bedroom. And if you try to only rub body parts with a soul that you're not joined with in a covenant relationship, you will destroy your soul and theirs. Paul warns against joining with the prostitute because you become one with her. So the church needs to reclaim romance and sex and proclaim that it is God's idea for our blessing, because sex is from God. But at the same time, we need to hold firm on God's moral standards for this part of our life, because sex is not God. We need to beware of idolatry in this area as well as every other part of life. And finally, the Song of Songs is brutally honest about both the joys and the difficulties of romance and sex. There is a thrill in closeness and delight in the other person, but there are many things that can come between and hinder romance. There are times of separation and longing. There are tempting distractions. So you have to work at romance. But romance is well worth the work. And that brings us to the question of application for this book. How should a Christian use the Song of Songs? First, we need to avoid any idea that certain Bible books are more important or more inspired than others. Every Bible book is equally inspired and equally a part of the canon of Scripture. But at the same time, we should also apply every book according to the author's intention and each book's purpose. In other words, we should apply each book to the context for which it was intended. And it might be that we're in situations that are addressed by the book of Romans more often than we're in situations addressed by the Song of Songs. So they are equally inspired, equally true, but not necessarily equally applicable to every situation. Therefore, if we're wise, we might very well use the Song of Songs as the text for a marriage retreat, or we may use it in private with our spouse. And at the same time, we probably should not study the Song of Songs in the 4th grade boys' Sunday school class. That might be just a little bit too inspirational. So now let's look at some key verses from the Song of Songs. Chapter 2, verse 7 says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and by the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires." Chapter 3, verse 5 says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you by the gazelles and the does of the field, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires." And chapter 8, verse 4 says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, do not arouse or awaken love until it so desires." Now, these three passages, obviously repeated for emphasis, give one of the main ideas of this book. That is, love can be excited and put in motion from an implied dormant state. But this should not happen too soon before the proper time. Now, let me just say, it is tragic in our culture that children are becoming sexualized at a younger and younger age before they are mature enough to handle it. And this damage is leaving lifelong scars. Now, it would be much better if they would wait and if we as a society would protect them from this until they could handle it. And it would be even best if they would only experience this according to God's standards in a caring covenant relationship, guided by a loving family. And these verses warn against the damage that happens if we are reckless with this gift. And that brings us to the last key verse. Chapter 8, verses 6 and 7 says, "Place me like a seal over your heart, like a seal on your arm, for love is as strong as death, its jealousy unyielding as the grave. It burns like a blazing fire, like a mighty flame. Many waters cannot quench love. Rivers cannot wash it away. If one were to give all the wealth of his house for love, it would be utterly scorned." Now, this passage demonstrates that love is powerful stuff. It is very difficult to quench love because it is so powerful. People would give all of their wealth for love. And that is why we should be so very careful to do love right. Love is like spiritual electricity. If it's done right, it can accomplish much. But if it's mishandled or used in the wrong way, it can fry you. So delight in love, but do it right. These are some of the main ideas of the Song of Solomon. And now let's look at the theme of the Song of Songs. I hope this comes as no shock, but the theme of this book is romantic love. There is a kind of relationship between a man and a woman that is a gift of God. It is given to be a blessing, a delight, and a glue that welds the two of them together into one. And we should celebrate and promote the proper kind of romance as God's intention for covenant marriage relationships. So now let's review. First, we'll review the theme of the Song of Solomon, which is romantic love. And now, because the Song of Songs is the last of the poetic books, let's review the poetic books. They're mostly from the Epic of the Monarchy, and they are the working out of the implications of and responding to God's revelation in everyday life. So now let's review the one-word summaries of the poetic books. If you'd like, take a minute, think through, and try to guess what word I will use to summarize each book. First is the book of Job. Now, there are a lot of possibilities here because there's a lot going on in the book of Job. But I've chosen the word creaturehood because one of the main messages of this book is that God is God and we are not. Next is the book of Psalms. Now, I think this one is fairly obvious, and I chose the word praises. Because all of the Psalms are praises to God, even the laments. And then is the book of Proverbs. And I'm sure you guessed, I would choose the word wisdom. However, you're right, because wisdom is the obvious choice for Proverbs, and I chose the word wisdom. And also because the fear of the Lord is 4 words. Now, I've summarized the book of Ecclesiastes with the word vanity. I could have easily chosen the word meaningless because the 2 words are basically interchangeable, but I had to choose one. And the message of Ecclesiastes is that without God, everything is vanity. And finally is the Song of Songs. And I've chosen the word romance. And I hope this choice is fairly obvious because romantic love is the theme of the Song of Songs. Well, we've completed the poetic books. I hope you've learned a lot and have been inspired to continue to study these books. But I also hope that you've been inspired to live out these books and that God is changing you and the way that you live because of what you've learned in these books. Now, in the next section, we'll start looking at the prophetic books with an introduction to all of the writing prophets. And I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Except I can't really see you. Thanks for watching.